Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all for coming tonight. This is probably the largest crowd I've had for an event in a long time. So, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Watson. I work in the Department of Political Science, but I'm also the pre-law advisor for the whole university. So, no matter what your major is, if you're thinking about law school, I am a resource for you. I'm here to help you decide whether law school is a good fit. I'm here to help you make sure that you are on the right track for getting your applications in, help you with that process. I'm also um, what's called a lifelong service, which means that if you decide that you want to take time off after you graduate, and and yes, hi Colton, the recording will be available later. Absolutely. So in any event, I'm a lifelong service. If you take time off, I will still be available to you or whoever takes my place in the event that I should die or retire or something like that. So you always have a pre-law advisor at UNT. Okay, so I just wanted to start with a quick rundown of the application process itself. And then I thought I would go through the timeline and then show you the LSAC interface. So the application process for law school is a very centralized process. The whole thing goes through an organization called the Law School Admissions Council, otherwise known as LSAC. They will be your best friend and your worst enemy by the time this is over. On the one hand, they are going to take a lot of your money. On the other hand, the fact that the process is centralized through LSAC actually makes it a lot easier in terms of, the number of transcripts you have to submit and that sort of thing. So when it comes time to submit a law school application, it actually consists of a whole bunch of little parts, right? Every law school has kind of a standard form that you access through the LSAC website that asks for things like, your name, your date of birth, the sort of standard biographical demographic questions. The rest of the components of your application include your LSAT score, and we can talk about the LSAT in a bit, but the LSAT is the law school admissions test. And your score, actually all of your scores for the LSAT will be sent to every law school to which you apply. Law schools will also receive your transcripts. You have to supply LSAC with transcripts from every school that has given you a grade for higher education. So what that means is that if you started at a community college or you transferred here from another four-year institution, or maybe you take some summer classes at Tarrant College, or you did dual credit in high school, if you have a letter grade that is associated with college credit, you have to have a transcript from that institution sent to LSAC. And what LSAC will do is compile all those transcripts, verify their authenticity. They will recalculate your GPA, and then they will provide all of the transcripts plus that LSAC GPA to all the law schools to which you apply. Most law schools require that you submit letters of recommendation with your application, typically two. This does vary from school to school, so it's one of those things that you want to be looking at the specific schools you're applying to. But the norm is to require two letters of recommendation. One of those I strongly encourage you to get from a faculty member. If you think of it this way, you are applying for a job as a student. So someone who knows what you are like as a student can provide kind of the best reference for law school. Your second letter could also be from a faculty member, or it could be from the supervisor at your job, the supervisor for a, a, a volunteer activity that you engage in, somebody who knows you at arm's length and knows you well, right? Who can testify to or recommend you on the basis of your character and your skills and your intellect, etc. You will also submit a resume as part of your application. So this is a chance for you to summarize all of that wonderful life experience you have with extracurricular activities and jobs, military service, etc. Law schools also ask for something called a personal statement. A personal statement is, I'm sorry, a personal statement is typically very short. They're usually maxed out at around 2 pages, double spaced. So you should have a very clear point in your personal statement. It's something I work with students on all the time. You don't want to kind of summarize your resume because they already have that, but instead focus on some aspect of your character or your skill set that you really want to emphasize. And then finally, there are a number of addenda that you may submit with your application. Real quick, I'm going to pause just a second because I see there's a question. What if you've graduated from UNT and just received this information? I was a BAAS major. I did not have too much interaction with my professors. That is an absolutely fair situation. In fact, a lot of students who are graduating this year or who recently graduated are in the same boat because of COVID. So a lot of people don't have those same sort of relationships to build on. Sorry, it's been a long day. If that's the case, if you don't feel like you can get a really solid letter of recommendation from a faculty member, especially if you've already graduated, it's okay to get your letters elsewhere. There are going to be some schools that may specifically require academic letters, and if they do require one, give them one, right? It may not be the most rich letter in the world. It may simply say, you know, Jane Smith got an A in my class, but if it's required, then you definitely want to follow those rules. But if it's not specifically required and you don't feel like you can get a really kind of useful recommendation from a faculty member, then definitely go to plan B. Definitely go to that boss, that supervisor, etc. That's a great question. And that's something we can talk about sort of one-on-one as well. We can kind of brainstorm who's going to provide the best picture of you to the law schools. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about these addenda because it's kind of mysterious. Addenda are basically supplemental documents that not everyone writes. So one type of addendum is called an academic addendum or an LSAT addendum. If you have something about your academic career that you feel you need to explain, for example, maybe there was a semester where your grades were really low because you were taking care of a sick family member or you yourself were ill. That's something you want to explain in an academic addendum. You want to say, hey, look, I know, you know, fall of my sophomore year was a little rough, but here's why, right? And provide some context for that, that sort of blip on your transcript. Some of you may end up with an academic addendum, again, because of COVID. That first semester was kind of brutal as we sort of transitioned to an online environment, or maybe your first semester taking fully online classes, it just wasn't a great experience for you. It might be something you want to explain. They're going to understand that, but it's a way to draw a big red arrow at the context, the reason for a blip on your record. An LSAT addendum, some people seem to want to write an LSAT addendum to say that they do not take, that they don't do well in standardized tests. That's not a particularly compelling addendum to provide. But for example, I did have a student who took the LSAT a number of times and did not do terribly well, and then was diagnosed with a learning disability for which they were entitled to accommodations. And so their score really went up. That's something you might want to explain, why your LSAT score was low for a number of administrations, and then it seems to have perked up. You might want to explain, I didn't just take the LSAT unprepared 3 times. Instead, something actually changed about the way in which I took tests. Another type of addendum is called a diversity addendum. Not every law school will take a diversity addendum, but most do. And it's an opportunity for you to talk about some aspect of your identity or experience that gives you a really different perspective than the typical law student. So that could be certainly race or ethnicity, but it could be growing up overseas, or growing up in a little town. One of the admissions personnel from South Texas College of Law in Houston said, if you grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin, I want to know about that, because that's unusual for a South Texas law student. That gives you you don't want to just say, hey, I grew up on a dairy farm, but you could say, this is how it has affected my perspective. This is how it has affected my experiences and the way that I might approach the law. So this is a great opportunity for you to tell them a little bit more about your experiences. I see I have another question about a letter of recommendation in your credential assembly service. We'll get to the CAS in a second, from 2020, but it's been a while. So that's a great question. Going back to letters of recommendation very briefly. Some law schools will specify that a letter should be no more than, say, 2 or 3 years old. If they don't, I think a good rule of thumb is that a letter that is less than 3 years old is probably okay. If it's from somebody that is still at UNT, for example, you might reach out to them and say, hey, do you still have that letter on your hard drive? Could you change the date and upload it again? I have absolutely done that. My experience with the student hasn't changed, so the content of my letter doesn't change, but the date is updated, and that may feel a little more secure. But generally speaking, it's okay to have a slightly out-of-date letter, one that's a couple of years old. You don't want one that's more than about 3 years old, because at that point you have hopefully matured and you're not the same person that they wrote that letter about. Does that make sense? So you want a recent letter. But this is a great point to make for those of you who are planning to take a year or 2 off. One of the downsides of going to a school with over 42,000 students is that your faculty forget quickly, right? We forget who you are, we forget names, we forget faces. It's just the nature of the beast. So if you know you're going to take a year off, but you're going to apply soon, then go ahead and get that letter and have it added to your account, which again, we'll talk about in just a minute. And that way it's just sort of sitting there waiting for you to apply. If you end up taking more time, taking 3 or 4 or 5 years, then you can just let it go, ignore it, and get different letters to submit. So back to addenda. There is also an addendum that some law schools will accept if you want to address why you specifically want to attend that school. SMU's law school in Dallas, they require this addendum. They require an essay about why you want to go to SMU. Texas A&M's law school in Fort Worth will accept that kind of addendum. They're happy to take that if you want to tell them why A&M is interesting to you, but they don't require it. So it's an option. It's another way to make a connection with the admissions staff. But if you don't really have a reason, right, if it's just like, oh, it's a school and it's here, then you can just ignore it. Finally, there's something called a character and fitness addendum. Every law school is going to have a character and fitness question on their application, and you have to read the question carefully. But basically, what it's going to ask for is whether you have any criminal history, any academic misconduct, any conduct violations, or any history of academic probation or suspension. 99 times out of 100, these things will not keep you out of law school. For example, if you had a minor in possession when you were 19 years old, that's not going to keep you out of law school. If you had a DUI, that's probably not going to keep you out of law school. They may be concerned if you had 3 DUIs last year. That might signal that there's an issue with your judgment or that you have a substance abuse problem. But for the most part, these things don't keep you out of law school. The character and fitness addendum is where if you check off the box, say, yes, I have something to disclose, the character and fitness addendum describes what happened. So you might have an addendum that says, on March 3rd of 2018, I was cited for minor in possession, etc. This was the outcome. This is what happened. I completed my probation and it went away. Whatever the situation is. It's incredibly important that if you have something to disclose, you disclose it. In some cases, that includes juvenile and expunged records. People may think those things are gone. They are not. They can be found. The state bar can find anything. And if you fail to disclose something, that is the surest way to end up either not admitted to law school, or if it's discovered later, possibly thrown out of law school, or being rejected and unable to take the bar exam. So it's super important that you are transparent with everybody about everything that happened, and just trust that hopefully it will not get in the way of law school. So all of these addenda tend to be fairly short, but again, they should be complete. So to the extent that you need to describe what happened with a criminal citation, definitely take the space to do that. A diversity addendum typically is not going to be more than a page long. Same with an academic or LSAT addendum, no more than a page long. One thing to keep in mind as you're pulling all of these documents together, your resume, your personal statement, and all of these addenda are written by you. They should look professional, and ideally they should look consistent. So use the same font across all of these documents. Use the same heading styles across all of these documents. It will make your package look like it all goes together and like you took care with them. Ultimately, once you're done writing all of these things, you save them as PDFs and you upload them with your application. Okay, I'm going to pause, see if there are any questions about addenda, application components before I move on.
I have a question. Would if say like our resume is, if it's like say very limited, would that be something that we included, like we could write an addenda for, like maybe like, oh, like I had to work full time to sustain myself, or I had a kid, or whatever?
That's a great question. So I know a lot of students have that particular issue, right? They're working 30 or 40 hours a week, taking a full load at school. There's no way to do a bunch of extra stuff. It's just not possible. Law schools don't expect you to be superhuman. For something like that, you probably don't need to provide an addendum. Instead, on your resume, next to that job experience, put in parentheses about how many hours a week you worked, right? That's going to signal to them, this is how I spent my time, right? This is what I was doing with myself all those years. I was busy. I was trying to eat. Um, law schools absolutely understand that, and they don't expect you to be superhuman. In fact, if you overextend yourself, um, they may wonder whether you have sort of the maturity or the perspective to succeed, because if you consistently overextend yourself, you're not going to do well in law school. So they want to see that you're making good life choices. Um, I think probably the only time that I would recommend an addendum for sort of a thin resume, um, I've had some students who, for example, transfer. And as a result, there's really no opportunity for them to pick up extracurricular activities after they transfer because they're not at UNT for very long. Um, it might be worth kind of pointing that out to law schools. Um, in theory, they should be able to look at your resume and see that timeline, but it may not be as obvious. So you may want to draw attention to that. The other situation is if you're taking care of family members, siblings, parents, grandparents, children, whatever. Having family obligations is incredibly important, and it's something that takes up your time. If you cannot find a creative way to include that on your resume, then you can certainly write an addendum about that. Great question. Any other question about addenda? All right. Okay, let's talk about money. I mentioned LSAC is going to take a ton of your cash before this is over. I was not lying. Um, Someone mentioned the Credential Assembly Service, it's otherwise known as CAS. When you join LSAC, your first account is free. You could register today for free, create an account that allows you to, for example, go to a law school forum or register for the LSAT, etc. But eventually, you need to purchase the Credential Assembly Service account. It's $195. And basically, for that money, they take your letters of recommendation and sort of verify those. They accept your transcripts, they verify those, and they recalculate your GPA. That's what you get for that money. um, One of hands down the largest expense for most people who are applying to law school is preparation for the LSAT. There are a lot of ways to prep for the LSAT. We can talk about some in a bit, but if you decide to take a formal class with a company like Kaplan or Princeton Review or Blueprint, those classes can be very, very expensive. They usually range anywhere from about $800 up to about $2,000. So depending on the modality, whether it's online or in person, how long it is, which company it's with, what it comes with in terms of maybe some additional tutoring hours, things like that, it can be very expensive. There are lower cost options that work for most people. It's one of those things that you have to think about. How do you learn? Do you need, for example, a human standing at the front of the class answering questions for you? If you do, start saving because you're going to want to take a class and it's going to be expensive. If you are one of those lucky people who learns really well by reading, you're going to get out of this a lot cheaper. Taking the LSAT itself is also expensive. It costs $200 to take the test. I strongly encourage people to plan to take it once. You can take it more than once if you need to, but every time you take it, you have to give them another $200. Then there are the fees for the applications themselves. Some law schools have an application fee. Those can range anywhere from $25 to $75. So that would be a check that you write, or I guess a credit card payment you make directly to University of Texas or directly to Harvard. In addition, every time you apply to a school, you need to have your file sent from LSAC to the school. So all of your transcripts and your LSAT score and that sort of thing. LSAC is also going to charge you $45 for each school to whom they send that record. Does that make sense? So if you apply to a school that has a $50 application fee and then you pay the LSAC fee, overall it's going to cost $95 to apply to that school. There are ways to get around these fees, and I strongly encourage you to use them. And we'll talk about some of those in a bit. In addition, there are some kind of hidden expenses that people don't think about. You probably are going to want to visit a couple of schools. You may want to do a couple of visits before you apply, just to get a sense of what law school is like, to see what are some of the things that affect the law school environment, things that you then might want to look for on websites. But certainly, I strongly encourage you to try to visit a law school before you go there. Every law school has its own personality, and it's really important that you go someplace where you're going to be comfortable. In addition, don't forget, you may have to move, and moving is not free, right? Unless you're going to just give away all of your stuff and start fresh, you've got to get your stuff from point A to point B. You may need first and last month's rent for a new apartment. You may need to buy books before your financial aid for law school comes in. So you want to have a cushion of money before you actually go to wherever your law school is. So the long and short of it is, this is expensive. And so I encourage you to kind of squirrel some money away anytime you get a chance, maybe into a special account specifically for law school. Let's talk about getting out of some of those payments. LSAC actually has a fee waiver program. It's not easy to get the fee waiver. They make you jump through a ton of hoops and provide financial information from both you and your parents. If you can't get information from your parents, you have to provide like written support verifying that you don't have a relationship with your parents. The whole thing is weirdly traumatic for some people. So I'm not going to say it's easy, but if you can get the fee waiver, it is worth a lot of money. The fee waiver covers the credential assembly service fee. It covers taking the LSAT twice, and it covers 6 of those LSAC school reports. In addition, LSAC has a product called Prep Plus, which is not actually preparation for the LSAT, but instead it's access to all of the old LSATs in digital format so you can practice. It's $99 for a year, but it's free if you get the LSAC fee waiver. So if you add all this up, that fee waiver is worth almost $1,000. So it is worth it to take the time to pursue that fee waiver. And it's something you want to do kind of early in the process so you can take full advantage of all of the things that they provide. I'm going to pause again. Do you still have to provide parental financials if you're married or file your taxes as head of household? That is an excellent question. And I believe the answer is yes. Which makes no sense at all. But I have definitely had students who were fairly far along in life who either needed to provide their parents' financial information or they needed to provide a letter from a third party, like a professor or a minister or somebody like that, to sort of verify that they were completely financially independent. So it's definitely something you want to. Oh, you didn't have to give parental financials at 24? Wow. Well, that's new because I've definitely had students much older than 24 who were pretty traumatized by the fact that they could not get their parents to turn over documentation. But that's good news. Maybe they've changed their policy. And uh, even if it looks like it's going to be insurmountable, try to get this fee waiver, right? Absolutely attempt to get the fee waiver. Most of the time when you submit all the documentation the first time, they're going to say no. At that point, you appeal because they give the fee waiver to more people on appeal than they do on the initial application. So it's one of these cases where the squeaky wheel gets the grease and you want to make sure you're the squeaky wheel. So keep asking for that fee waiver, provide them with whatever they need or tell them why they can't have it, right? You definitely want to be assertive here because it's a lot of money that's at stake. And that's, $960 that you could spend on LSAT prep or that you could spend on traveling to visit a school as opposed to spending it on all of these things that LSAC is charging you for. Any other questions about fees?
I had a question.
Yes.
So what if you've already paid for some of these expenses, for instance, the Prep Plus and the CAS fee and one of the LSAT fees? Would it still be worth it to apply just in case you want to take it a second time and for those school report applications?
I mean, I think that then becomes a question for you, right? If you could save $470, would the effort of applying be worth it? For me,
Right.
it would be, but it kind
But
of
is it looked upon negatively by the LSAC as like, well, you had the ability to pay for this much, why can't you pay for that much?
I don't think so. I think, you can probably make a pretty good case that, hey, I've given you all the money that I possibly can, and now I need help, right?
Okay.
So I wouldn't let that dissuade you. Besides, ultimately, we don't really care what LSAC thinks about you, right? As long as they don't think you cheated on the LSAT, you're fine. So I think it's worth it to ask.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the timeline for applications. So I don't know how many of you here are first year students, second year students, et cetera. But if you are in your first 2 years of school, or if you're planning to spend some time after you graduate, working or doing something else. So law school is more than a few years out for you. There are still things you can be doing now to improve your chances of getting into law school down the road. The first and most obvious is get good grades. Every grade you receive is ultimately going to be part of your LSAT, your LSAC transcript and your LSAC GPA. UNT has this really generous grade forgiveness policy, right? Where if you, let's say, take biology your freshman year and you fail it, and then you take it your sophomore year and you get an A, UNT only counts the A in your GPA, right? That's great. Unfortunately, when you send your transcripts to LSAC and they recalculate your GPA, they are going to include the F and the A. So your LSAC GPA may actually be lower than your UNT GPA. In other words, there are no free passes in this process, so you definitely want to try to get the best grades you can throughout the process. If you had a rough start in college or you had a bad semester here or there, that doesn't mean that you can't get into law school. Not, I don't want to suggest that at all. Um, but your life is easier, right? Your passage into law school is easier if you don't have anything you have to explain, right? If you just have a 3.5 or a 3.6 or a 3.8, then it's just easy for you. So it's something that you can do now. Another thing you can do is get to know your professors. So again, we were just talking about the fact that some people don't have those relationships with faculty. There are lots of reasons for that, especially if you are an online student or if you were a student primarily during COVID. um, there are lots of reasons not to have those relationships. But if you have the time, I encourage you to build those relationships. Be intentional about it. If you have a professor that you really like, that you do well in their class, they like the way you write, they seem to engage with you, take them again, right? 2 or 3 times. Um, get to know them. Let them know that you're thinking about law school, because then they'll sort of view you that way and they'll be filing away information for a later letter of recommendation. I'm going to pause for just a second because there are 2 GPA questions in the chat. One is about passes for spring of 2020. A pass on your transcript does not affect your LSAC GPA at all. So it doesn't help you, it doesn't hurt you. It's just like it didn't happen, right? Um, if you take a class pass fail and fail it, then it does affect your GPA for LSAC purposes. But those Ps from those passes from spring of 2020, or if you decide to take some, physics class pass fail or whatever you're allowed to do, typically that just will not affect your GPA at all, as long as you get the P and not the F. Similarly, W's on your transcript don't affect your GPA. I see that just came in twice. W's don't affect your GPA. However, if you have a bunch of W's, that's probably something you want to explain through an academic addendum. So for example, maybe you withdrew from a semester, so you have like 5 W's in a term. You might probably want to explain that and say, hey, this is what happened. This is why I had to leave temporarily. Or if you have W's kind of scattered all over your transcript that might look a little hinky. Again, it's something you might want to explain, but it doesn't affect your GPA. And there was a question, I need to scroll, about the range you want your GPA to be in when applying. In an ideal world, I mean, the higher the better, right? The higher your GPA is, the easier it's going to be to get into law school and the more likely you are to get money. So there's no sort of there's no sort of maximum. I really like students to be at a 3.5 or higher. I feel like that makes, again, your life easier, but I have certainly had students, even in the high 2s, who get into law school. So part of that depends on the individual law school. Each school is going to report their median GPA and their median LSAT score Um, it's also going to depend on what else you have on your record. So maybe your GPA is low. Let's say you have a 2.8 for some reason. Um, if you can explain those grades, right? I was sick or something happened, or I started off college really, as a very immature person, and I am now a more mature person, and you can see this trend in my grades. And then you also do well on the LSAT, it can make up for a lot, right? So that's really one of those questions that it's hard for me to give you a general answer because there are lots of contingencies involved. Um, oh, sorry. There's a question about recommendations, whether or not you should get more than two. Some law schools will allow you to submit 3 or even 4 letters. The only value to going above the 2 is if that third and or fourth letter is going to be rich, right? And a third letter that says Joe got an A in my class does not help. A third letter that says, yeah, she's okay, really isn't going to help, and in fact might hurt you. But if you have 3 or 4 people who know you well and can talk about you, in a rich and detailed way, and you have good relationships with them, then sure, go ahead and get those additional letters. But don't get one just to get one, only if it's going to really add something to your application. Let me see, are there more messages? W's.
I have a
Additional.
Oh, I'm
Oh, I'm
sorry.
sorry. I'm just real quick gonna hit the questions in the chat, and then I'll come right back to you. There was a question about taking additional classes to raise your GPA. Um, that's great if you have not already graduated. Once you graduate, once you walk across the stage and they hand you a diploma, your undergraduate GPA is set. So taking additional classes after that will not change your GPA. But if if you're still an undergrad, you still haven't graduated, and you want to maybe do an additional semester to go above the 120 credit hours, that's kind of your call. It may make sense to pick up an additional minor or something like that. I wouldn't do it just to do it. But if you're going to pick up an additional minor or pick up a second major, or if it gives you the opportunity to study abroad or to go to DC or something like that, and it's also going to raise your undergraduate GPA, then that's a bonus. There's also a question about being in the honors college. It doesn't actually change the standards for your GPA. Honors doesn't add points to your GPA, but law schools will see your transcript, right? So they will see, oh, well, that B was in an honors class, or that B was in organic chemistry, or whatever. And they will certainly see that you have honors when you graduate, so that maybe you wrote a thesis or something like that. So it's not that it certainly won't hurt you. It will probably help you, but it isn't going to change the way they calculate your GPA. Okay, there was a question that was coming through verbally.
Yes, sorry, that was me. Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
I had a question. You answered it with the withdrawals thing, because in my experience, just recently last semester, um, I'm a PR major, but my minor is political science, and I'm in the pre-law program,
Mhm.
set to graduate. Um, with my issue, I'm a little worried only because I've done pretty well. I'm kind of like at a 3.7, and I've taken your legal class
Yeah, that's
um,
great.
with an A. But I recently, I think last semester, I had you for
Mhm.
constitutional law.
Yes.
And I did get sick, and I ended up basically having to withdraw from all 5 of my classes, including yours.
Yes.
So my thing is that I've taken the constitutional law before with Eddie Meters, but I wasn't ready yet, so I withdrew, and then I technically withdrew from yours the second time. Will it look like will it look bad if I try to reattempt to take the constitutional law class, like maybe with you again, to remove that W and get a letter grade to
Um,
apply?
so absolutely not. That would be totally fine. If you withdraw from one class, like say because you start taking it and you're like, oh shoot, I'm a sophomore and this is like clearly a senior level class. That's fine, right? One W, they're not even going to notice. Then when you have like a chunk of them for a semester, that's where you definitely want to write that academic addendum, but that's an easy explanation, right? I was sick. I had to withdraw. It will not, that will allay any fears they have about why you dropped those classes. It will be very clear that in fact you did honestly the mature thing, which is to withdraw rather than fail. Um, if you have a semester where you failed, don't get me wrong, you just want to say, hey, I know I should have withdrawn. It's not a big deal, but you did the right thing by withdrawing if you were ill. So that's not going to hurt you. And if you take it a third time, it doesn't look like you're taking it a third time. It looks like you're actually now taking the class. Does that make sense? So it certainly wouldn't hurt you to register for it again. Absolutely not. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. Mhm.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I don't think you have anything to be concerned about based on what you just said at all. Okay. Let's fee waiver we covered. First 2 years. So getting to know your professors. The third thing you can do is during those first 2 years is get connected, get informed, right? This is a great time to make sure that law school is a good choice for you. You don't want to put all your eggs in the law school basket and then get to your senior year in college and realize, oh, I really don't want to do this. And now I don't know what to do, right? And you certainly don't want to actually go to law school and pay a year's worth of law school tuition and then discover that it's a bad choice, right? Because then you owe money and you don't have a law degree. So this is going to law school is something that you should only do if you are very certain that it's a good fit for you. And figuring that out is something that you can start doing early. Taking classes that are law related, um, shadowing an attorney, doing an informational interview, watching YouTube videos. The pre-law office has a YouTube channel. Most of what is on there is not stuff that I've created, but instead it's interviews with attorneys talking about their area of specialty, what a day in the life of a lawyer is like, classes, law school classes that have been recorded during COVID. So you can see what a law school class is like. Um, Sort of watching trials. You can go to court. In fact, I really encourage you to go to court if you can, because then lawyers and judges will talk to you. And most legal proceedings are open to the public. But if you can't get to court, watch actual trials on YouTube. Um, don't watch Law and Order because that's not real, but watching real trials is a great way to see what the day-to-day life of a lawyer is like, at least a litigator. Um, Another thing you can do to sort of get connected is find other pre-law students. We have organizations on campus. We have a chapter of Phi Alpha Delta, which is the International Legal Fraternity. We have a chapter of the National Black Law Students Association. We have a moot court team. Many of the moot courters are planning to go to law school. And then you also are likely to meet other pre-law people in some of your classes. Again, particularly if you take law-related classes. Connect with these people, get to know them, right? First of all, they're going to be your colleagues someday, but also there are things that you can do with them, like go to court or visit a law school, so that you don't have to do it by yourself. Um, and then finally, you can get involved. So we talked about this a little bit already. Um, Not everybody has time to do 18 extracurricular activities. Um, that's okay. What you want to do is be intentional about the way you're spending your time. So if you have a job, right, because you need to pay the rent and put food on the table, then think about how are you going to spin this job to illustrate the strengths and skills that you have. For example, if you work at Chipotle, anyone who's come to talk to me knows that I always use Chipotle as this example. If you work at Chipotle, that may not seem to be relevant to being a lawyer, but there are tasks at your job that are going to illustrate different skills. Maybe you close, right? In fact, I just reviewed a resume of somebody who pointed out that they closed their store. They had to tally the cash register receipts, right? That illustrates that you're responsible, that you're detail oriented, and that you're organized. Maybe you do inventory, right? Again, that shows that you're detail oriented and organized. If you want to eventually um, uh, sort of drive home that you have great communication skills, find a way to use your job to show that. Maybe rewrite the employee manual or train people or do a social media campaign or organize an event for the staff, and keep track of these things that you're doing so that down the road you can take all of these little bits of evidence and weave them together to show who you are as a person. So I think it's really important to pause for a second to point out that there is no individual perfect law student, right? Um, you can't just look and say, well, if I do X, Y, and Z, if I join a fraternity and I'm the president of my fraternity and I join SGA and I do moot court, boom, I'm going to go to law school, right? That is not, that's not how it works. Law schools are looking for diversity and they're looking for authentic humans. They have to spend 3 years with you, and you're going to carry their name out into the world as an attorney. So they want you to be a good person. They want you to be a responsible person. They want you to have strengths and values and skills. So one of the things that you can do early on or now, either way, depending on where you are in school, is take a minute to reflect about who you are and the you that you want to convey to law schools. What is it you want them to know about you? And are they going to see it in your paper application, right? So, for example, if you write your personal statement about your passion for animals, but the law school looks and sees that you never took a class related to animals, animal rights, the environment, anything even remotely like that. You never volunteered with an animal shelter. You never got a job at a vet's office. Then why not? Right? What have you been doing that you haven't sort of pursued this passion that you supposedly have? If you want to drive home the fact that you are a great communicator, you cannot just put on your resume, I have great communication skills. You can't. You may be able to do that when you're trying to get a job, but not for law school. Instead, you have to show that. have something on your resume about a paper you've written or a presentation you've given. Write something and get it published. Um, take classes that are focused on public speaking or on writing. You want the things that you have done to provide evidence of who you are. In order to do that, you need to know who you are. And so taking some time to sort of think, what is it that I want my application to say about me? And how am I going to prove that that is true? Right? It's worth the time. I see real quick, there's a question about where you can find the recording for the rest of the presentation. I'll send out a link via my emails, and it'll be on the YouTube channel as well. Okay, questions about, oh goodness, it went the wrong way. Questions about where we are so far. Perfect. Okay. This just suddenly got ugly. So the application timeline for years 3 and 4 suddenly becomes a lot more focused. And you'll see that I have these weird dates on these columns, like fall of 2020, 202x minus 1. That's because, he does not touch my mouse. That's because this timeline is based on when you want to start law school. So if you are going to take time off after you graduate, this isn't stuff you need to start doing your junior year in college, right? Or maybe you are already considered a junior, but you're not going to graduate for a couple of years. Or maybe you're considered a sophomore, but you're actually going to graduate real fast. No matter what that looks like, what you want to do is think about the fall in which you want to start law school and work backwards for these things. So typically, if you're going to go straight to law school after you graduate, the first sort of point in time where we need to get really focused is fall of your junior year. At that point, you want to start identifying schools that may be of interest to you. You don't want to narrow things down too much because you don't know what your GPA and your LSAT score are going to be. So you don't know how competitive you're going to be, but you want to start identifying an array of schools that may be of interest to you down the road. Your junior year is also when you can start attending law school fairs. LSAC hosts a lot of those events. We also have every spring, the Criminal Justice Department does this big event where they invite all the Texas law schools along with a bunch of employers. Those sorts of events are great opportunities to get those fee waivers that we talked about, so that you don't have to pay $75 to apply to Harvard. Your junior year is actually also when you probably want to start studying for the LSAT. I know that seems like it's really early. You don't have, the general rule of thumb is you want to give yourself about 300 hours to study for the LSAT. I personally would like you to spread those 300 hours out over a year, as opposed to studying intensely for a couple of months. The reason for that is that the LSAT is not a content-based test. You don't have to memorize names or dates. You don't need to know case law, nothing like that. Instead, it's a reasoning test. And the way you learn, it's almost like learning how to do a cartwheel. Right? At first, you're just sort of watching other people do it, and then you're slowly like putting your hands on the ground, but you don't actually get your legs over, and it takes a while. But what you're ultimately aiming for is being able to do a cartwheel without thinking, right? You just say, I'm going to do a cartwheel, and you do it. That's what you want to get to with the LSAT, and that usually happens by spending a longer period of time studying slowly. I like to refer to it as the brisket method. right? Low and slow. So starting early on LSAT preparation is a good idea. Fall of your junior year is also a great time to apply for that LSAC fee waiver, again, so that you can take full advantage of all of the things that it provides. Spring of your junior year, you probably want to go ahead and bite the bullet and pay for that credential assembly service. You're going to continue to study for the LSAT. And if you love me, you will start writing your personal statement because I can work with you a lot in the spring in a way that I cannot in the fall. And I love helping students with their personal statements. That summer between your junior and senior year, if you feel prepared, you can go ahead and take the LSAT that summer. It's usually offered in June and then either July or August, and again in September. You could go ahead and take it that summer. It's also a good idea at that point to start once you have an LSAT score, to create that list of schools to which you are going to apply. If you're not taking summer classes, you can actually go ahead and order all of your transcripts that summer as well, because your grades won't change before you submit your applications. So go ahead and order your transcripts, get that out of the way, get those sent to LSAC. Then fall of your senior year is crunch time. If you haven't taken the LSAT, ideally you will now take it. That's when you're going to ask for those letters of recommendation. That's when you're going to polish your resume and all of the essays associated with your application. And ideally, you will submit your application that fall. Application deadlines aren't until February or March, but there are advantages to submitting applications early. Most law schools use something called rolling admissions, which means that when their application cycle opens in September, they start taking people. They start accepting people and giving them money. So the longer you wait, the fewer seats you're competing for and the less money you're competing for. Now, if you get to February or March, there are still going to be seats available. There's still going to be money available, but the competition is going to be a little more fierce at that point. In addition, the application cycle is exhausting for the people who read these apps. Getting to them when they're fresh and excited about the incoming students is ideal, right? You'd rather them read your personal statement when it's the first one of the new year, not after they've read 300 personal statements that say basically the same thing, right? Fall of your senior year is also when you want to submit your FAFSA for the following year, right? Most people end up taking out loans for law school, get that FAFSA in. Spring of your senior year, hopefully your applications were already in and you're starting to hear from law schools. This is a great time to visit your top choices if you can. If you find yourself on a wait list, you can write a letter of continued interest, and eventually you're going to want to submit a seat deposit. And then finally, that summer after you graduate, you will submit a final transcript from UNT to your law school to verify that you graduated, and then you start law school. I want to take just a minute, if it hasn't disappeared on me, which it has. I'm going to show you really quickly the LSAC website. They let me log in as a fake student, and that is what I've done. So this is what your credential assembly service account will look like, what the interface looks like. And you'll see it has these lovely handy tiles to register for the LSAT. There's a writing component of the LSAT, which you take separately. So there's a separate tile. Credentials and CAS. You can search for schools. The official guide actually lets you enter your GPA and your LSAT score, and then it gives you a probability band for your admission to all of the law schools in the country. You can add schools so that they show up on your list of like your to-do list, if you will. Um, I'm gonna come back to credentials and CAS. And this is where you would purchase CAS, where you add your institutions. Again, these are the schools to which you are going to apply. Here's where you enter information about your recommenders. Let's say I was writing you a letter of recommendation. You asked me, I said yes. You would go to this tab and you would enter my information. Dr. Watson, here's her email address, phone number, etc. And at that point, LSAC would send me an email. I would then click on a link and upload your letter. So you actually never touch the letter, you never read the letter. It just exists in your file. And here's information about that fee waiver. Again, I highly recommend applying for that as soon as possible. Information about requesting transcripts. Oh, actually, I think adding institutions is the schools you've attended. Sorry. So that then your transcripts get matched up. The interface is actually, I would say it's kind of a middle ground between awesome and awful, right? It's not the most user-friendly interface I've ever encountered, but it is so much easier now than it used to be. I cannot even tell you. Okay. And then finally, I just want to kind of conclude with some resources for you. If you're not already on it, I have an email list. If you go to prelaw.unt.edu, you can click on a link and add your email to that list. Anytime there are internship opportunities, changes to the LSAT, classes that are interesting, events like this, I send that out to my email list. So it's a great way to know what's going on. There's also a link to the pre-law Canvas course, which I use as a website. It has tons of information about the application process and links to useful resources. You can enroll in the Canvas course if you're a current student, and that way it shows up on your dashboard. Or if you prefer, you can just bookmark it. Even if you've graduated, it's a public course, so you can still, you can't register for it, but you can sign up. If you go to the Canvas course, there's a question in the chat about how to enroll. If you go to the Canvas course, there's a link on the homepage of the Canvas course to enroll. And you just click on it and you enter your EUID and you're enrolled. So you can do it yourself. I also mentioned before, there's a pre-law YouTube channel that is linked from the Canvas course. It's linked from my emails that I send out. Pre-law has a link tree. I'm all over the web. So just, get connected if you can. And then of course, I am a resource for you. And like I said, I'm a lifelong resource. I'm here to help you. I will spend as much time as you want helping you through this process. So take advantage of me. Come start seeing me early in your career, so we can kind of brainstorm together. And then down the road, I can help you with the actual applications. I see there's a question in the chat. Is your GPA calculated from all the schools you've attended? And that is, yes, it is. Unfortunately, UNT does not calculate that GPA. So it's not something you can see in your UNT portal. Instead, what you need to do is Google college GPA calculator. And then you can simply enter grade, number of credit hours, grade, number of credit hours, etc. And it will calculate your GPA for you. And again, you want to enter any grade you got for a dual credit course from high school, any grade you got at another four-year institution or a community college. And again, if you retook a class, you want to enter both grades, the first grade and the second grade, right? The lower grade and the higher grade, because they will both be counted in your LSAC GPA. So it's something you can calculate yourself. It's just not something that we have access to through UNT. Any other questions?
Dr. Watson,
Yes,
I have two quick questions.
of course.
So with the, oh yeah, I apologize if you already said this, but I know I was looking briefly at a few schools and they were talking about an early application process, but specifically like an exclusive one where if you apply early, you can't apply anywhere else. Is that a pretty normal thing for law schools to do?
So early decision is, yeah. So a lot of schools have an early decision program. For example, they may say, if you get your application in by December 15th, we'll get an answer to you by the end of January. That's awesome, right? That just gives you information. That's great. Some schools have what's called binding early decision. UT, for example, has one of these programs. Let's say you apply to UT's binding early decision program. So you get your application into University of Texas by November 1st, and you check off the box that says, I'm doing binding early decision. You can actually submit your application early and not do binding early decision. But if you check off that box, if you are then accepted to the University of Texas, you are obligated to go there. You can apply to other schools, but for the love of God, don't apply binding early decision to two schools, because then you're somehow obligated to go to two schools and you can't do that, right? So let's say you applied binding early decision to UT and you got in there, but they only give you $5,000 a year in scholarship. And then you also applied to SMU and they give you a full ride. Doesn't matter. You have to go to UT. If you don't, SMU is going to find out about it and they may rescind your admission because you have breached your agreement. So the only reason I would ever encourage anybody to apply binding early decision is if you have a school where no matter what they give you and no matter what other schools give you, you will go there, right? Like if I said, I will pay full price at UT rather than go for free anyplace else in the country, then by all means apply binding early decision. Otherwise, I do not recommend it because they may give you some advantage. I think UT guarantees some small scholarship if you're accepted through that program. But chances are good, if they want you, they're going to give you that scholarship anyway. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's very helpful.
I'm not a fan of binding early decision, unless, again, unless you absolutely desperately want to go to that school.
Okay, but that would not doing binding early decision wouldn't stop you from submitting your applications earlier.
Correct. Yes,
Okay.
you can submit starting September 1 to the vast majority of schools.
Okay.
It's possible that there are schools where you can't submit that early unless you do binding early decision, but I do not know of any. So like at UT, for example, you can submit September 1st and not do binding early decision.
Okay, awesome. And then the other quick question I had was just with the transcripts. It's coming back to me now. I kind of forgot about that. But when I applied to undergrad for or UNT, I turned in my transcript, and then I think, if I remember correctly, I turned in like my senior year grades after I'd already been accepted and whatnot. So is that similar with law school? Like you'll send in your first 3 years and then you'll do your last year like later?
Yes, yes. So law schools are going to use whatever grades you have at the time you apply. So if
Okay.
you have your application, if you submit your transcripts based on the summer, right after you start your senior year. So you've got those summer grades. And then you submit your applications. Those are the only grades the law school is going to have. If you haven't heard from them and you get a 4.0 or whatever, do really well fall of your senior year, you can send a revised transcript to LSAC and then contact the school and say, please pull my grades again because I had an awesome semester.
Mhm.
And they will do that. But you
Okay.
don't have to. And then that last semester, typically you will have made a decision partway through the semester. So you only need to submit that final transcript to the law school in order to prove that you graduated. But if you're still actually riding on a wait list at that point, you can submit those revised grades as well.
Okay, wonderful. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? You've all been so patient.
I had a question. Actually, I had two.
Sure.
Okay, so as far as like taking the LSAT goes, I know that ideally it's best to just take it once.
Yes.
But say I take it like this August, how long would it be, since I know that they're doing still online, I believe, how long would the turnaround be to get the results back?
So with the online version of the test, which even when we do it in person now, it's going to be electronic, right? So they'll give you a tablet. You won't take it on paper. And the turnaround time is about 3 weeks for the LSAT. So as long as you've submitted your writing sample, it takes about 3 weeks to get your score, maybe 4 if they're checking something for some reason, but typically about 3 weeks. And your scores are good for 5 years.
Okay, wow. And then, okay, that's good. And then my second question, say that you take it like twice, do law schools look at every attempt? Like do the first and second attempt get sent? And if so, like, do they pick the best one? How does that work?
So yes, they all get sent to the law schools. Law schools will see every time you have a score with LSAC, every score within the last 5 years, all the still good scores they will see. But they say and they mean honestly that they are going to use your highest score. So for example, I had a student who took the LSAT. He was prepared, but he then took a class after he took the LSAT the first time, and he improved by about 13 points, which is phenomenal, right? Huge jump. I can guarantee you, based on the schools he got into and the money that they were giving him, that they were using that higher score. They were not holding him to the lower score. So if you take it and say get a 155 and then you take it again and you get a 147, they're going to use the 155, right?
Okay.
Making the decision.
Okay,
When
thank
you
you.
start, sure. I just quickly want to add that where you get into trouble is if you take it lots and lots. There is a limit to the number of times you can take it, 7 in your whole life. If you take it 7 times and it's really low, and then all of a sudden it's high, they might think it's a fluke, right? So that would be something you would want to explain.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you so much.
Sure. Anybody else? Questions?
I have one.
Yes.
So if it comes down between GPA and LSAT, which is more important? Like say your GPA is really good, but your LSAT's maybe really average. Would that give you a chance at those upper echelon law schools that maybe your LSAT may not make you available to?
So when you have a kind of a gap like that, we say you're a splitter. If you're going to be a splitter, I would rather your strong score be your LSAT score, but it's not like I'm not sure I can answer that question. I generally believe that the LSAT is marginally more valuable than the GPA, right? Your GPA can be affected by the specific program you are in, whether your professor was going through a divorce the semester that you had them. All sorts of things can affect your GPA that the law schools cannot see. And they can't really compare a 3.5 in philosophy from Harvard with a 3.5 in biomedical sciences from UNT, right? Or biochemistry. Those are apples and oranges. So making those head-to-head comparisons is hard. Everyone takes the same LSAT. So it is the great equalizer, right? That said, definitely people get into schools on the strength of their GPA and the rest of their application, as long as their LSAT score is not really low. A really low LSAT score can really make it impossible to get in. I'm not going to lie. But a mediocre LSAT score with a strong GPA, it's worth it to try. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that helps. I hope that was clear
does.
as mud.
I haven't taken the LSAT yet, but I'm nervous about it. I've been doing some light studying on it. Nothing that I've paid for. I've been just using the Khan Academy, and it
Yeah.
seems to help me at least a little bit. So, but
Yeah, there
we'll
are
see when that day of reckoning comes.
there are some things you can do for the LSAT prep that I think help a lot. And some people have already heard me talk about these things. Now that for the next academic year, the LSAT is going to continue to be remote, meaning you get to take it where you want to take it, as long as it's a quiet, private place. So you can take it in your bedroom or your dorm room or your parents' living room or wherever, as long as it is a quiet and private place. One thing you can do to help your score is to try to study at this time of day you want to take the test, in the location where you want to take the test. Try to sort of mimic the test as much as possible during your studying. And if you suffer from test anxiety, there are things you can do, like self-hypnosis, which sounds ridiculous, but it 100% can help. There are things you can do. The LSAT is a mind game, right? And you will do so much better if you recognize that you can absolutely 100% do it and relax. Does that make sense? So
Absolutely.
try not to be nervous, which I know is like saying,
I hear
please
you.
ignore
I
the
hear you.
elephant in the
I
room.
struggle with, but I'm working on it and I'm getting better and I'm building that confidence, which I feel like
Good.
is probably the most important thing, is just being
It
confident in my abilities.
It is 100% the most important thing. Yes. Anybody else? Last questions? Okay, well, you all know where to find me. So if you do think of something, let me know, and definitely stay in touch. No matter where you are or how you feel like you're doing in this process, don't assume that, like, for example, that it's all hope is lost, right? Definitely come talk to me. There are strategies to overcome just about any obstacle you may see between you and law school. If it's something you want to do, we will do everything we can to get you there. Okay? All right. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Watson.
You are